Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Tom Lanny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures and conferences and special programs that explore questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. Our talks are online, as today's talk will be in a couple days. So when you see your friends, you tell them they missed something good. They can at least get, watch it on a little TV or something, get second best. It's not as good as being here, but it's, it's something good. So, and those are at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Today I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Zimmerman, who's going to explore the history of America's longstanding controversy over teaching controversial issues in public schools. He'll explain the restrictions on public school teachers and frame a case for lifting them. I want to thank Professor Jack Schneider in the back for proposing the lecture and the Department of Education for co-sponsoring with us. Professor Zimmerman is a really excellent speaker to talk about this. He recently joined the University of Pennsylvania faculty as a professor of the history of education. Previously, he was professor and director of the University of the History of Education program at New York University, where he also served as chair of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. And he received NYU's Distinguished Teaching Award. His scholarship is focused broadly on the ways that different people have imagined and debated education across time and space. He's authored books about sex and alcohol education, two things wouldn't be of interest, right? History and religion in the curriculum, Americans who taught overseas, and the historical memory of public schooling. His most recent book, Campus Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know, and Too Hot to Handle, A Global History of Sex Education, were both published this year. He's co-authoring a book with Emily Robertson on the teaching of controversial issues in American public schools, which we'll hear more about today. His work has appeared in the Journal of American History, the Teachers College Record, and History of Education Quarterly. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Review of Books. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer and a public school social studies teacher. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Zimmerman.
Yeah, if you actually read any of those books that were kindly enumerated, you may become the first person who's not a blood relative to do so. Although we could be related, because Americans often are. My brother, who's a corporate lawyer, has nothing better to do than to send me my Amazon rankings of all my books, generally in the middle of the night. We'll say, did you know you just went from 2 million to 1.5 million? The very first book that I wrote, somebody gave me this 800 number that was allegedly a publisher's clearinghouse where you could type in the number and you could follow your sales. And being a much younger man and naif, I actually did this. And so I typed the 800 number and you get the robo voice and it said, "Good morning, you have sold 0 books today." So that wasn't getting me any closer to God. I actually haven't done it since. But thanks so much for coming out on this lovely afternoon, and thanks to Jack Schneider especially for inviting me, and to the college. I've never been here, and I spent a little while in the archives, and I spent a long while walking around. Next week in my own religious faith is New Year's, is Rosh Hashanah. But for a little while today, I felt that I was getting my Jewish holidays mixed up because wherever I went, I saw these T-shirts saying Seder Nation, thinking, what is it, Passover? But then I got wise to it. I also, of course, thinking of Rosh Hashanah and of Passover, I thought of my grandmother, to whom this next book about the subject of teaching controversial issues is dedicated. One of the most amazing things that happened to me in my life is that for 16 years, I commuted between Philadelphia and New York, and I lived with my grandmother 2 nights a week until she died at the age of 104. And to be a 50-something person and to get to know a grandparent in that context is, I don't know anyone else who's done it besides me. Grandma and I, over these years, we talked about everything except for one thing. We never talked about her fellow teachers who lost their jobs during the McCarthy era. That was the one thing she refused to talk about. Like lots of educated Jewish women of her time in New York, she was a public school teacher. And she had several friends who lost jobs because of that. And I still have, although I've found archival material about my grandmother in different archives, I still haven't figured out what's behind this. But in an interesting way, it did lead to this project, because the project is really about what you can't say. The original title of it was going to be "You Can't Say That." One of the other books that I wrote was called "Who's America?", which is about controversy surrounding public schools. But really, it's about controversy outside of the schools, how citizens have argued about religion and about history. And when people read that book, they said, appropriately, well, what goes on inside the school? I mean, what about controversy in the school? And friends, the short stories, of course, there are teachers that have engaged in controversial issues in our schools. I know I had some, and I bet you did as well. But that's the good news. The bad news is, across the past 200 years, teachers have engaged in controversial questions at their peril, especially during wartime. It's been extremely difficult for them to do so. Part of that is just because of public pressure, with people on both sides pushing on you, pushing their view on you. The easiest and the safest thing to do is often to ignore anything that's controversial. But there's more. I think in many times and places, our teachers actually haven't been prepared professionally to engage in controversial questions with their students. I think especially in recent years, the demands on teachers and on schools have been so inordinate, especially in the age of so-called high-stakes testing, that often there isn't time for the real engagement in controversy, even for people that want to do it and are prepared to do so. And then most depressingly, there really aren't legal protections for teachers in this country. Teachers don't have free speech rights in their classroom, which was one of the most astonishing and depressing things that I learned in the course of this project. So that's a real downer, okay? It's not all bad news. But what I do as a historian is I try to go back in time and try to figure out where all this came from. That's my job. And so I'm going to go way back in time and survey a huge landscape. I'm going to try to limit my comments as much as possible, because given the subject matter and given the moment we're in, of course, what I want is some controversy from you. But if you start with the creation of the common school systems in this country, in states like Massachusetts in the antebellum era, the creation of the first state systems, what you have to get is that although these systems were born in controversy, that is, Americans argued over their structure and their purpose, right, and their finances, they were designed to avoid it. Schools in this country were created to avoid controversy. Since we're in Massachusetts, let's quote Horace Mann. 1844, "If the day ever arrives when the schoolroom shall become a cauldron for the fermentation of all the hot and virulent opinions in politics and religion that agitate our community, that date the fate of our glorious public school system will be sealed and a speedy ruin will overwhelm it." He says if parents think their kids are being, quote, indoctrinated into political heresies, they will, quote, withdraw their children from the school and resist all appropriations. The moment the common school cause is connected to any of the exciting party questions of the day, I shall never get another cent. Horace Mann is essentially a circuit rider for schools. He's going around Massachusetts and then eventually the North and the Northwest, trying to get citizens and state legislatures to ante up, to pay for schools. And what he's saying here is, if any of these citizens get the idea that the schools are teaching any kind of doctrine that's controversial, that may offend them, or may not match their own opinions, they won't pay. They won't support the creation of these systems. So he says that if a teacher in the course of teaching encounters a, quote, controverted text, he or she, and it was mostly she at the time, should read it, quote, without comment. And for those of you who study this era, you'll recognize that term, because Mann and others also said that you should read the Bible in school without comment. Obviously, Americans had different interpretations of the Bible. just as they did of anti-slavery or temperance or anything else. So if you come upon anything that's controversial, just read it, don't comment, don't let anyone else do so. As best as we can tell, teachers abided by these restrictions. Most teachers probably didn't sense any restriction at all. Why? Well, they're mostly 17 and 18-year-old women, and they're too busy trying to teach 8 subjects to 70 kids / young adults aged 3 to 20. If there was political instruction in the schools, as best we can tell, if you look at things like the McGuffey Reader, it followed a very standard God, country, family paradigm. It was not controversial. It was designed not to be, is the point. So Jacob Abbott, who's a prominent educator in the 1850s, he writes this really interesting article where he defends this. And he says, with respect to McGuffey and these messages, teachers should lead students to accept, not to question, the existing order. They're hired to follow the will of their employer, the taxpayer, so they have no right to wander away from that purpose. And please remember that statement, because when we come back to it, I'm going to argue that essentially our courts have said the same thing right now that Jacob Abbott said in 1856. Teachers' only job is to support, lead students to accept the existing order, follow the will of their employers. When teachers did deviate from community opinion in the 19th century, as best we can tell, they're fired. If you look at Boughs' Review, which was kind of the major tribune of the slaveholding class in the American South, it writes about anti-slavery teachers, which it said were wandering on in the South. And it says, why should the rising generation be taught doctrines which were in direct conflict with what we believe? Why? Okay, right, we're planters, we're white supremacists, okay, we pay for these institutions. Why should our kids be taught anything that we don't agree with? A Virginia newspaper actually editorialized that anti-slavery teachers shouldn't just be fired, they should be killed. Listen to this. So full of abolitionism are many of this teacher class, so full of guile, fraud, and deceit, that the deliberate shooting of one of them for poisoning the minds of our children would be perfectly justifiable. So that's the 19th century. Moving very rapidly into the 20th and the so-called progressive era, mass immigration, the mass high school, the rise of the social studies. This is also the birth of something called progressive education, a different doctrine. And some educators start to tell a different story than Horace Mann about controversial issues, right? They think that education should be active, not passive. It should be grounded in experience, not just in books. It should be focused on the community, not just in school. It should engage the kids instead of just jawing at them, which is, by the way, what I'm doing right now. So it should also engage kids in the central public issues of their lives, i.e. current events. And one of the fun parts of this project was doing a little mini history of the current events lesson. In 1908, 2 teachers in New Jersey wrote the first book about current events, the current events lesson, and they said, and I love this language, the classroom is a democratization factory. Isn't that cool? The classroom is a democratization factory. Not the old-fashioned recitation room where students come to say over and over again what textbook authors have said. And they suggested that people clip out something from the newspaper. You ask every kid to clip it, and they bring it in and report on it. That's what I did as a kid. My sister is bringing up 2 kids in central Jersey, actually, near Princeton, and she told me that recently one of her kids' teachers, in 6th grade, did the current events assignment, please cut out an article and bring it in. And a kid in the class said, where do we get a newspaper? I mean, at least the kid knew what it was, right? They just didn't know where you could actually obtain one. But that was the idea. And we think that by 1920, 90% of school districts are, quote, teaching current events. High school history teachers especially, some of them devote as much as 1 class period per week to it. And to quote a New York teacher, Benjamin Glassberg, quote, we asked our students to discuss their clippings, not just to read them. And again, you see this progressive language of critique, right? Not just repetition, but, engagement and analysis. But here's the problem. After the United States enters World War I, which remember was in 1917, right? That war began in 1914. The U.S. comes in late, always, right? World War II, right? September 1939 it starts. We're not in until December 41. The gap was even bigger in World War I. But this fellow Benjamin Glassberg, ironically, he's this great tribune of the current events lesson in discussing their clippings. His own case actually shows the limits upon classroom discussion and upon controversy. He's going to get fired. What happens is this guy Glassberg, the advocate of current events, he tells his class that the U.S. government was, quote, suppressing true reports about the Bolsheviks. Right? Remember, after the war begins, right, we got the Bolshevik Revolution and that Russia gets out of the war. Suppressing true reports about the Bolsheviks, who are, quote, not as bad as most people think. And then he also told the class that, quote, being a public school teacher, he was not allowed to tell the truth to his pupils. And that, by the way, is the worst thing you can say. You can't say that there's stuff you can't say, ever. That's the real taboo. And that's what got him rung up. As best we can tell, all of this lasted 5 minutes. That was 5 minutes too long, and he's fired. His case works its way up to the associate superintendent, this guy named Tilsley, and he writes this really interesting letter where he says, the teacher should correct notions held by students that are in opposition to fundamental American ideas. That's the teacher's job. If somebody says something that's opposed to fundamental American ideas, you're supposed to correct it. Well, Glassberg lawyers up, and he's got a great attorney, and the attorney writes this response saying, honest and free discussion of public measures is the fundamental American idea, and it is the superintendent, not my client, who is violating it. This, of course, falls on deaf ears, and he's fired. Then there's a second New York City teacher who's fired for the paradigmatic progressive education lesson. Write a letter to the president. Right? Active, not passive. It's critical. It's engaged. So write a letter to Woodrow Wilson commenting on his conduct of the war. I actually found these letters with this sort of thing you never find. And most of them are, they're praiseful to the point of sycophantic, right? Thank you, Mr. President, for making the world safe for democracy, and so on. But there's one kid that takes a different tack, and this is what his essay says. This is a 12-year-old. You are ready to slaughter us all. I do not sympathize with the autocratic Germany. But how is it that the United States, a country far from democratic itself, and England, the imperial and selfish, undertake to slam democracy upon a nation, whether it likes it or not? This is in the kid's essay. So the essay catches the attention of the English department head, tells the principal, works its way up to the same superintendent, this guy Tilsley. This is amazing. Tilsley then instructs the kid's teacher to correct the paper. And the teacher writes lots of critical remarks in the margins. And we've got the essay, including, here's what the teacher writes, is there any sanity in this assertion? These are things in the margins. You can imagine your professor writing this in the margins. Do you take these remarks seriously? Sorry to find this unintelligent comment in your work. But check this out. These critical comments are not critical enough for Superintendent Tilsley, who responds, after looking at all this, that the teacher should have impugned the kid's patriotism, not just his prose. Listen, here's Tilsley. The teacher should simply have written, this letter shows an absolutely wrong attitude on the part of the boy, that it's essentially seditious and immoral. Like, enough of this little carping in the margins about analyzing each little statement, blah, blah, blah. No, the assignment itself is immoral and potentially treasonous. This is what the superintendent says. There are some assignments in the world that are not proper for a classroom in a public school, and this is one of them. It gives the opportunity for unpatriotic sentiments. And in my book I write, there's almost nothing I agree with that this guy Tilsley wrote except the very last statement. It gives the opportunity for unpatriotic sentiments? Damn straight. If you take it seriously, for sure it does. And as you might have read right after this point, late 1917, this is when school systems start to pass new measures and sometimes laws barring, as in the case of New York, the utterance of any treasonable or seditious word. 10 years later, about half of our states have passed teacher loyalty requirements. That is, you have to swear loyalty to the state or federal constitution and so on. So, in the progressive era, I think it's fair to say you do have a little bit more discussion, a little bit more activity and engagement, but then the war comes and it constricts. And we're going to see that rhythm in the next couple eras. Going to the interwar period, especially the Depression, after the stock market crash, you do see more discussion and more debate. This is one of the reasons that historians love the Great Depression, even though people were really poor, right? It's struggling. There was certainly lots of controversy, lots of discussion, and there was more in schools. So if you look at Muncie, Indiana, where Robert and Helen Lynn went in the 20s and then again in the 30s, when they get there in the 30s, they interview the teachers, and one teacher says to the Lynns, "I'm facing a new problem nowadays. My pupils insist on raising questions." I like that, a new problem, like raising questions. What's with that? Right? And then the teacher says, and this is important, "I have an uneasy, furtive sense about it all." Isn't that interesting? So the kids are raising questions, but it's kind of weird and awkward, right? I have an uneasy, furtive sense about it all. And clearly some teachers did raise some really interesting questions in class. So you look at, I found a couple great memoirs from the 30s, and this guy looking back at his high school and his economics teacher. The economic teacher begins a course with a bunch of true-false statements, including, and remember, this is during the Depression, any man who wanted a job can get one. Remember, there's a time 25% national unemployment, but in Akron it was 60%, and in Toledo it was 80%. Yeah, imagine that. Like 2008 sucked, right? It was not like this, right? 80% adult unemployment. So any man who wanted a job could get one. It's a rather controversial remark. Most kids agree. And then, this person in their memoir looking backwards says, "The teacher gave us a verbal trouncing. The blast at my corner grocery store axiom stung me bitter. It was a masterful stroke of good pedagogy to blast me out of my all too convenient belief." But friends, here we come to a really interesting question. Was the teacher trying to challenge the kid's belief? Or was he trying to change it? Those two are different. They're absolutely different. Okay? But some teachers started to lose sight of that distinction. What they wanted to do was get the kids to agree with them, or have a debate that was so open and so critical that the kids agree with them. Right? That would be known, friends, as Zimmermans Fallacy. You've heard of Zimmermans Fallacy, right? It's extremely famous. All right? I'm shocked you haven't heard of it. It goes like this. If we had a truly critical debate, unencumbered by cant and propaganda, everyone would agree with me. This is all around us. It's horribly cynical, all right? I mean, it's false, right? But it's all around us, and it's bipartisan. It existed in the 30s too, right? That's pseudo-debate. A debate with a preordained outcome is not a debate. If you actually believe in the debate, you don't know where it's going, right? But this happened during the 30s too, and you can tell because you look at demonstration lessons. What happened is teachers' unions sometimes during their in-service training would have a demonstration lesson. So they'd bring in a class, and then somebody would teach it, and the other teachers would watch. And my favorite example, this is the teachers' union in New York. It's a lefty-leaning, sometimes communist union. They do a demonstration class in 1939 at a conference about Andrew Jackson. And they link him to Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic president at the time. Why? They're both the tribune of the common man, fighting the powerful interests. And there's a teacher who objects that the lesson is biased. And another teacher says, well, sure, it's biased. That's okay. And the teacher says, we want students to reach a certain point of view. If you use critical processes, the students themselves can be trusted to reach the democratic point of view. You see? There's this one, mine, right? So if people really think about Andy Jackson and FDR, they'll see that they're both tribunes of the common man and that the Republicans suck, right? Because they're so critical. But then at this same demonstration, another teacher brings the whole discussion down to earth. And she says, look, this is the Depression. We've got classes of 50 or 60 on double time, sometimes even triple time. What that means in real English is the country was so destitute and poor that in some schools you had double time, so kids came from like 7 in the morning to 11 and then left, and another group came like from 12 to 4, or triple time, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., 9 to 12, 12 to 3. Yeah, that's what happened here. And she says, look, we're on double or triple time. You're talking about using critical thinking and debate. She says, we must use authoritarian lecture methods. We have no choice. We've got classes of 50, 60, 70, right? We're going to have all this in-depth discussion and analysis. No. Another teacher says, most teachers are overworked, worn-out specimens who aren't interested in propaganda for socialism, atheism, communism, or any other ism. They're too overworked to care about it. Teachers have to teach Sunday school, which, by the way, they did in public schools, a different time, raise money for the school, comply with all these new legislative requirements. I mean, we didn't invent that. I mean, back then it's Arbor Day, Temperance Day, Flag Day, all these days the legislature wants to put in there. Teachers got to do it. And she says, we're so completely swamped, we have little time for anything else. Yes, there's more discussion in the 30s. Okay, there's no question about it. Some of it is propaganda, as discussion often is. Okay, propaganda veiled as discussion. And then also, school districts are hiring a lot of unqualified teachers, and some of them just don't have the knowledge or the skill to do this. Howard Beale was a historian at the University of Wisconsin who wrote this book called Are American Teachers Free in the 1930s. It's 612 pages long, and the answer is no, they're not. And he talks about all the different ways that they're not. But he says at one point, because teachers themselves are products of authoritarian pedagogy, it's never occurred to them to approach their subjects critically. He said, among history teachers especially, many do not know that they are not free. They do not know what is at issue. By 1940, there are 150,000 high school teachers teaching subjects that they hadn't studied themselves at all. Many of them in social studies, right? Many of them are hired because, they're good at basketball. What you call the history teacher at 3 p.m., right? Coach! Okay. And that dates to this time at all as well. And the biggest obstacle is still the public itself, right? People like me call this pedagogy democratic, but what we can't get our arms around is that big parts of the demos, i.e. the people, the public, don't actually want it. So in California, this one parent writing about a teacher who should be fired says, the basic question is whether educators are going to be our servants or our masters. I'm not at all ready to turn over to the educators the training of my children along political, religious, and social lines. It's distasteful to find the school working at cross purposes with the parent. Like, I don't want kids learning to question me, or what I think. Who wants that? Who wants to pay for that? So even in this 30s heyday of discussion and controversy, yes, there are teachers fired for doing it. So I found this really poignant case in a small town in Illinois, Belvedere, Illinois. A teacher whose name was Hugh Bone. And Hugh Bone organizes student debates in the 32 presidential election, right? Okay, UB Hoover, UB FDR. He sends students into all the town offices, to study government at first hand. I mean, this is a real progressive educator. And then he's fired. The students stage an all-school walkout. 2,000 kids walk out of the school. And then, like all fired teachers I've been able to research, Hugh Bone lands in graduate school in Madison, Wisconsin. There seems to be some ironclad law that every fired teacher must go and get a graduate degree at Wisconsin. And I find him there, and he writes in a letter, the professors here compliment me on being fired. They say most teachers are not virile enough to really teach. And now we get into weird gendered stuff, and the figure of the cowed teacher becomes this kind of stock figure among lefty educators at this time. So Horace Callan, who's the guy who coined the term cultural pluralism, he says of teachers, job holding makes cowards of them all. This other educator says, teachers of controversial issues need not be sissies. They must be real men. They must take some risks. Well, let me be really clear about this. I am not calling on teachers to take risks. I know what the risks are. Okay, that would be unbelievably precious of me. Okay, I'm a fully tenured, full professor at a major research university, the things I'd have to do to get fired, I can't even say. Okay? I mean, that's how bad they are. Okay? So I understand the constraints that teachers are under, right? And in no way am I endorsing this idea, but I do think it's really interesting, especially at a time when the teaching force is still overwhelmingly female, right? You've got these mostly male educators saying, don't be a sissy, be like a man, okay? Well, easy for you to say, dude, right? I mean, like with your tenure and your tie, wherever it is that you work. So now we're going to see, this contrapuntal, this accordion rhythm again. After a little bit more openness during the interwar period, we're going to have World War II and the Cold War, and it's going to close. I mean, you say teachers should take some risks. During the Cold War, the risk just becomes too great. After 1948, 15 states passed new loyalty laws for their teachers. They have to, generally swear they're not members of subversive groups. I dug up these laws, and it was really interesting and wacky. The Georgia law, you have to swear that you're not a member of over 200 organizations. And some of them, like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, I'd heard of, right? But then the last one, the Yugoslav Seamen's Club. I am not now, nor I have never been, a member of the Yugoslav Seamen's Club. Yeah. And across urban America, especially, teachers are fired, including several close friends of my grandmother. And it's really hard, because people didn't talk, right? It was hard to research this part, and a lot of it I got through jokes. You don't have to be Freud to understand why jokes might be very illuminating in a situation like this. So at the 1953 convention of the National Education Association, biggest teachers union, this guy gets up to tell a joke. And this is what he says. He says, okay, there are two rabbits, and one rabbit says to the other, I'm scared that McCarthy's going to investigate antelopes. And the second rabbit says, well, what are you afraid of? You're not an antelope. And the first rabbit says, yeah, but how can I prove it? And then in the account it said nervous laughter, which was just awesome, nervous laughter. And yes, students did rat. They did inform on supposedly communist teachers. In Los Angeles, I found that one of the students who ratted on his teacher was a fellow named Lynn Nofziger, who would later become aide to Ronald Reagan. When he's a kid, he leads an attack on two of his former teachers. His sister says that they saw a copy of the Daily Worker, it was a communist rag, on like on their desk. So the safest move is just to keep quiet about anything remotely controversial. And the Washington Post ran an editorial about this in 1950, which said, and I quote, "School teachers are like the Sphinx. They avoid anything controversial." And again, when I read that, I'm like, because if you've done work like this, you know that sometimes you can just think that you're insane, and that you've imagined all these patterns and it's like all in your head. And then you actually find an edit in the Washington Post and it's like, oh, I was actually right. Like I hadn't just imagined this. So they try just never to mention anything controversial, including communism, including the Soviet Union. Oh, and by the way, the American Revolution. No. War of Independence. Right? Revolution is what the other team does. There was no American Revolution. War of Independence. There was a school teacher that was reprimanded by her district for telling her class that the Soviet Union was larger in area than the United States. The only problem with that was it was true. But who cares? Right? And there was a really interesting poll done, again in New Jersey in 1954 of teachers, and over one half replied that they would never compare the U.S. and the Soviet Union in class. The question is, would you ever compare them? Why not? Well, for fear that the students would get the question wrong, right? Have the wrong answer. And the American Bar Association releases this really interesting statement where they say that schools shouldn't teach about communism at all. They say that's too much like asking students to attend lectures on picking combination locks. Like, why would you teach somebody like how to do something that's evil? Why? But then comes Sputnik in 1957 and all these fears about the Soviet Union is maybe ahead of us. And, there's this new idea that kids should have to learn the comparative virtues of the U.S. vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And instead of the picking combination locks, instead of the metaphors coming from criminal justice, this is also the heyday of polio. So we developed this new metaphor from the public health world. And suddenly somebody says, if the public health were threatened by an epidemic, would not the children be instructed in the proper method of combating the disease? We inoculate our children against polio. We should also equip them in the face of an epidemic that will cripple their minds and enslave their bodies. So instead of, we don't want to mention this because that would be like teaching them to pick combination locks. Okay, now we do because we want to inoculate them, right, against this, right, just like we do with polio. And so the American Bar Association switches gears and it picks a new committee to prepare lessons on the instruction of communism and its contrast with American liberty. The head of this committee is a lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, whose name was Lewis Powell, who would later, of course, become a member of the Supreme Court. I mean, this project was amazing because it was kind of like Forrest Gump. You just see all these people like trotting through history. It's like, whoa, like who knew? Lynn Nofziger, Lewis Powell, right? And teaching about communism very quickly becomes a thing, that is, becomes institutionalized. So 6 states require it by law, 34 education departments make provisions for it. The laws are always good to read. Always read the law. I mean, they're amazing. The Florida law says all kids must get 30 hours a year, which is a lot, in, quote, the dangers of communism, the ways to fight communism, the evils of communism, the fallacies of communism, and the false doctrines of communism. That's what the law says. It also says that schools must teach that, quote, the free enterprise competitive economic system of the United States has produced higher standards of living than any other system on earth. Like that was what the law said. But teachers continue to avoid it. Some say they don't know enough about it, which makes sense because it was ignored prior to that time. Why would they? Okay, and they're also afraid that they'll be misinterpreted. This one teacher writes in a diary, with one false move, I'll be read myself. So that's the 50s, and you see, we're doing this accordion thing. Okay, you get into the 60s and 70s, it shouldn't surprise you, okay? We're going to see some more openings. Obviously, this is the era of protests for civil rights and for Vietnam War. It's also the era where, the Supreme Court for the first time says that both students and teachers do have free speech rights. They've since been reined in, as we're going to find out in 2 minutes. But the Tinker v. Des Moines case, which is 1969, okay, that's where the kids wear black armbands to protest the war. They were suspended, and ultimately, all right, the court said you can't do that. And Justice Fortas wrote, okay, that neither students nor teachers, okay, check their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gates. You still do have First Amendment rights, or you did. But, I looked more carefully at the 1960s, and it turns out that throughout the 60s and 70s, students are protesting, and one of the things they're protesting for is to address controversial issues in their classrooms. Like, you don't protest for stuff you already have, right? There's no protest for oxygen, although actually one day there may be, okay? But, these very protests tell you that actually there wasn't that much controversy in the classroom. This is also the era where, for the first time, people can do tape recordings easily, right, of classrooms, right, because the cassette recorder, which was so modern then. So people start doing that, and they start, analyzing all these tapes. And one study of about 50 social studies classes finds that 4% of class time is devoted to, quote, normative issues. Bunch of other studies, maybe 8%, 9%. And teachers still do have good reasons to avoid them. It's still dangerous. Tinker said students and teachers don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, but teachers didn't really have them. So in Indiana, there are 5 teachers who wear armbands to school themselves, and the school board charges them with insubordination. They're eventually fired, and this banker on the school committee, I found this great interview with him, and he says, look, a teacher who criticizes us, our community, is like a teller in my bank that criticizes the bank. He says, you just say, I'm sorry, we can't use your work anymore. It's as simple as that. So, again, I think There was absolutely, I'm skimming over a lot here, there was absolutely more controversy during the 60s and 70s, but as in the 30s, I think it's easy to exaggerate and romanticize it a little bit. But it's definitely the high watermark of discussion in classrooms, because starting in the 80s, we're going to see that constriction. 80s is the time of nation at risk and back to basics. 38 states require minimum competency exams. And we see the beginning of this emphasis on measurable outcomes. So there's an enterprising reporter who goes into some classrooms in the 80s and is asking teachers why there isn't more controversy. And one of the teachers says, if you deal too much with controversial issues, which don't lend themselves to right and wrong answers, you can't measure what's been learned. Like, if there's no right answer, how do you know what the kid knows? As the schools are loaded with yet more things they need to do, right? HIV happens, it's time for AIDS education, right? There's gang problems, it's time for anti-gang education. Kids are doing drugs, we got drug education. Soon it's going to be anti-bullying education, right? Global education, and on and on. There's this really poignant teachers conference on the subject about teaching the Vietnam War. Now we're into 1990. And this guy gets up and he says, look, this is all really nice, but what's the point? I've got 15 minutes for the Renaissance, 15 minutes for the Civil War, 15 minutes for the Vietnam War. He's like the Zimmermans of the world. They're like, come on, let's have a discussion. Like, let's learn who Ho Chi Minh was, right? Okay, let's learn about the French and Dien Bien Phu, you know. Let's imagine we're JFK or LBJ or Nixon trying to decide what to do. He's like, I got 15 minutes, okay? How am I going to do that? And then again, the problem of preparation. So in 91, when the first Gulf War begins, the one with Bush Sr. that nobody remembers now, a lot of teachers just don't know what to say. In Pittsburgh, 150 students walked out of class to protest the fact that schools weren't talking about the war. They're suspended for 3 days, and their ringleader, who has a brother fighting in the Gulf, is suspended for a week. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette covered this really closely. It's tough reading because a lot of teachers tell the Post-Gazette, they say, you know, look, we can't really teach about the Gulf War because it's not in the textbook. I'm like, dude, it happened last week. Like, of course it's not in the textbook. And incidentally, if that's all you're going to do, maybe you should think about doing something else. Okay? Not everybody has to be a teacher. There are lots of other good things to be. But more than anything else, all right, and here we come to the depressing end, the problem of teacher rights. What happened starting in the 2000s is the courts severely limited, some might even say obliterated, the First Amendment rights of teachers in their own classroom. So in 2007, there's a really important case involving an Indiana teacher whose name is Deborah Meyer, and this is what happened, Deborah Mayer. When the big Gulf War started in 2003, she was teaching a lesson about it from Time for Kids, which is the district-sanctioned current events magazine. And you may remember that before we attacked Iraq, it was clear we were going to, and there were a bunch of demonstrations in Washington and elsewhere. And this article had a picture of one of those demonstrations. A kid in the class said, Ms. Mayer, have you ever been to an anti-war demonstration? And she said, yes. As a matter of fact, I drove by one in Bloomington the other day, and I honked my horn in support because I think that people should try to settle their differences peacefully without violence, which is why also I'm in charge of like the school conflict mediation system. She's fired. And it's upheld. The ruling says the school system does not regulate teacher speech as much as it hires that speech. Expressions of teacher stock in trade, the commodity she sells to her employer in exchange for a salary. And that really does bring us back to Jacob Abbott, right? Teachers are hired to follow the will of their employer. Friends, there have been teachers who have been fired for doing lessons I did in my own high school classrooms. So American Library Association's Banned Book Week, I just saw some stuff about banned books here. Kind of a classic assignment, a high school assignment that I did myself is pick one of these books on the list. I want you to read it and report to the class about why it was banned. Teacher in Ohio did that. All right. Okay, she's gone. Look, teachers aren't or shouldn't be paid ventriloquists for the state. Their job is to make future citizens who can understand and, yes, critique the people who govern them. To me, the big question is whether the rest of us are going to allow that. And at a time when teachers' professional status has never been more tenuous, and I would add, when our political environment has never been more polarized, not in my memory, or more vicious, you've got to be really sanguine about any of this happening. Okay? Look at what's been reported about Trump in schools. Here's what's been reported. Most teachers are avoiding it. Okay? They're avoiding it for a bunch of reasons. One, they're afraid that somebody's going to complain. Sometimes the principal has told them not to mention it. Sometimes, I think, with the best of intentions, but I would argue the worst of logic, they're afraid that minority kids will be scarred. They want their class to be a safe space from Donald Trump, even though, of course, the kids know who Trump is and, have heard all about him. No, we can't go there. We can't talk about this. And then some teachers have just propagandized for or against, okay, often in the guise of discussion. So there was this interesting case in Maine where this kid comes in with a Trump shirt, and the teacher says, "You can't wear that shirt in my class." Well, you don't have to like Trump, but Trump is one of the nominees for president, and he can wear the shirt in the class. He absolutely can. The kid's interviewed, and this was really interesting. It shows you how much misunderstanding there is about these subjects. Kid's interviewed, and he says, my dad's a school teacher. This is in another district. And the kid says, and I know that, teachers aren't supposed to say what their political views are. That's actually not true. Okay? They're not supposed to propagandize their views. Okay? Teachers can or should be able to say what they think. They should not be able to demand that the kids share what they think. But that's where we are, okay? Either avoidance or some kind of propaganda. So you've got to be sanguine. You've got to be pretty realistic about this changing. I'm sorry I didn't discuss these questions with Grandma, but I think there are historical reasons why we didn't. But in my happy moments, and I do have some, I tell myself that history isn't destiny, that we can discuss these questions in our classrooms if we as a polity, if we as a people decide to. On 9/11, I'm in New York because that's where I worked for 20 years. And I'm walking north in the square at 901 towards the arch. And this homeless guy panhandles me. And he says, "Can you help me out?" And I did that sort of embarrassed duck and weave. Sorry, I can't, kept going. And I hear the guy behind me. He says, "World Trade Center on fire." I'm not proud of this. I didn't turn around. You hear a lot of things in Washington Square. Okay? I got to the office. I found out that he was right. Obviously, classes were off. They were off for the whole week. And what was I going to do? I went to Grandma's, And we just watched on TV over and over again the buildings coming down. And we heard the announcers say, well, one thing they kept saying was, you may not be old enough to remember this, but they kept saying, "We're all New Yorkers now." That lasted for like a week. Okay, all right, we are not all New Yorkers now. Then the other thing they kept saying is, everything has changed. Everything is going to be different now. Everything has changed. Friends, I don't think that's right. I think it's wrong. I think that nothing's changed, not in the things that I care about, and that nothing will until Americans of every mind agree to let our students and their teachers make up their own. Thank you very much. So, as usual, I went like 10 minutes longer than I wanted to, but please, questions of any kind. Right, well, here's the thing. This episode you're talking about has become quite well known because it was a mom in Texas, an African-American mom, who just happened on this in her daughter's textbook. That's how it became like a meme, like a thing. But here's the problem. There's always been a lot of erroneous and sometimes hateful stuff in our textbooks. Okay, there's much less than there used to be. Okay, the problem, though, is every time one of these issues flares, what happens is the publishers are encouraged to remove anything even remotely controversial. Yes, there's stuff that's wrong, okay, but the outcome isn't good because in the end, all right, what the publishers think is we should have less about slavery maybe, okay, or just say something totally anodyne about it, right, about the whole subject of race, like Martin Luther King wanted peace, or Malcolm X, or Malcolm the 10th, as my high school students used to call him, wanted, any means necessary. What do you think, right? Just something vapid, something that won't offend anyone. Look, I think it's great that you have parents who are looking at these textbooks and scrutinizing them for errors, and that was simply an error, right? But let's also remember, okay, that if what you want are parents scrutinizing textbooks, you're also going to have parents scrutinizing the health textbook and removing descriptions of contraception, and in one case, also in Texas, demanding the removal of a passage about a breast self-exam for cancer. And at the textbook commission, the publishers generally roll over and play dead because it's in their interest to do that. Yes, of course, we'll get rid of that. But it was late in the day, and apparently one of these publishers said, now tell me exactly, what do you object to? And this citizen, this woman who come in said, well, it's our feeling that if a young woman does this self-exam, that she'll become sexually aroused. WTF! It's a cancer. I mean, this is like we're Focus on the Family and Howard Stern and come make a perfect circle, right? Only a twisted heterosexual brain could think that there's anything erotic about that, right? It's a cancer exam, right? So, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? I mean, I think it's terrific that this mom was looking at her textbook and finding things that were wrong, but you have to understand, right, that there are people from all over the political universe, okay, who are doing the same thing. And what that does, in many ways, is it creates this irony that you have all of this controversy outside of the schools, like we're talking about right now, but almost none of it gets in. When I wrote Who's America, which is about the controversy outside the schools, I wanted to call it Storm Over the Schoolhouse, and the publishers didn't like that title, but to underscore that it was over the schoolhouse, right, rather than in it. Well, Luke's raising a huge question. I do worry about it, but I also think we should distinguish between two kinds of political correctness. And if you're really starved for entertainment, you can Google me in two kinds of PC later on. You can see my take on this, If political correctness means that there are huge social prohibitions on calling blacks the N-word and calling Jews kikes, not laws, by the way, but social prohibitions, that's a political correctness I completely support. I don't see how those words add anything to our discussion, right? But if political correctness means that if you oppose race-based affirmative action, somebody will accuse you of racism, or even complain to the administration, right, that they've been traumatized by your racist act, then we've got a problem. To me, those are different kinds of issues, right? In my campus politics book, I go into this because one of the things I was amazed to discover is that, according to the most recent surveys, 40% of American full-time faculty oppose race-based affirmative action. I should tell you I'm not in that 40%. I'm a supporter of it, okay? But I was surprised to hear that the number was that big, and then I was embarrassed, and here's why, okay? That means a lot of people aren't speaking up. Because, especially at campuses like mine, virtually the only faculty voices you hear on this subject are pro-affirmative action. Okay? The fact that the antis aren't speaking up, that can't be good for affirmative action, in my view, or for universities. But I do think it's important to keep in mind, especially in the era of Trump, right, to look much more carefully at that term, PC, right? If PC prevents, at least socially, not legally, Donald Trump from calling women pigs, I'm for PC. I see nothing wrong with that, right? Because Donald Trump calling women pigs doesn't add anything to our understanding. I'm not saying it should be illegal, by the way, because I don't believe it should be, right? But if by PC we mean there should be social prohibitions on it, absolutely. Like, you should be embarrassed if somebody hears you referring to women as pigs. You should be ashamed of that, and if that means PC, fine, right? But right? If what it means is that you can't or you don't feel comfortable taking a minority political position, right? One that millions of other people take because you feel like you'll be accused of some sort of bigotry, then we've got a problem. what I try to do in my book is, it's called Campus Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know, which is a pretension. That's just the name of the series. But it is written for a public audience, and I'm trying to give everybody as much as I can about some very complicated subjects in a short space. In my academic freedom chapter, what I say is, the real crisis in academic freedom is not for the tenured and even the tenure-track faculty. We've done a pretty nice job of protecting our academic freedom, right? It's for the people that don't have those protections. The adjunct faculty has almost no protection. So there was an adjunct, okay, in Illinois that was fired for doing a class exercise in which he asked the students to define pornography. Not like to watch pornography, right, or to defend pornography, to define it in the course of a lesson. That could never happen to you or me. I'm imagining you're a tenure-track person too. And so that's the real crisis, The real crisis is not for people like you and me, It's really interesting. I mean, I found myself quite critical of some of the critics of universities who said there's a crisis in academic freedom because, Ward Churchill got fired and Stephen Salida wasn't hired by the University of Illinois. Look, those are isolated cases. Salida himself had a great payday, and now down in Florida, it's Florida Atlantic, I think, or International. Ever heard the name Jim Tracy? I mean, you talk about how strong academic freedom is. Check this out. This dude, Jim Tracy, writes on his blog that the Newtown attacks are a hoax. Okay? And he even sends a certified letter to 2 parents of a murdered child in Newtown, okay, asking them to, quote, prove that they are the parents of a murdered kid. He was fired, okay, because the university said that he hadn't, on his forms, disclosed all of his outside activities and money-making activities. What the university didn't say is the reason they want to can him is because he's a lunatic, okay, and what he said is just crazy and wrong. They can't do that, and the reason is he's tenured up. I mean, that shows you the strength of it, and I support that, actually. I don't think the guy should be fired for that, because if he did, right, where does that end, right? I couldn't exert the same kind of freedoms that I exert, right? But it shows you how strong it is. If that guy was an adjunct, he'd be gone yesterday. That's the real issue. Yeah. And my student friends, the adjunct crisis none of it will change until you and your parents start demanding that for all the sacrifice and money you're making, that you get full-time faculty teaching you. Until you ask for that, the institutions will keep hiring part-timers. Why shouldn't they? Everyone goes away happy. All right? You save a bunch of coin. I was an adjunct for a long time. They're not all bad teachers, right? But they don't have academic freedom, okay? And they can't, except at their peril, engage in the kind of discussions that a tenured person can. This also is, all of these questions are great, and we could do an hour on each one of them, I am extremely troubled by let's just say the political monocultures in the places that I've worked. That would be NYU and Penn. If I have any colleagues who are Trump supporters, they're like closeted gays. I mean, they're so deep in the closet they don't even know it. So the reason I'm also a journalist, to be honest, because I also write columns, is precisely for this reason. That gives me interlocutors with people that don't share my opinion, right? I would never, ever have an exchange with a Trump supporter if I wasn't also a journalist. But every single time I write, I meet lots of Trump supporters, right? And that makes me smarter in ways that talking to my colleagues doesn't, because I don't actually learn a whole lot from people that I agree with generally. I mean, I'm an unreconstructed McGovernite. I'm a liberal Democrat. I'm just like all the other professors. I've never voted for Republican, But I will say this. The thing that troubles me the most is these monocultures you see echoed all over our political world. So it's not just the university, right? I mean, you look at the way we've segmented our lives, okay? Bill Bishop wrote this great book a couple years ago called The Big Sort. And the takeaway of The Big Sort is your chances of ever meeting somebody of a different political party are declining, okay, because of where we live. So, if there's a Whole Foods within a mile, 80% of people vote for Obama. If there's a Crackle Barrel within a mile, 80% of people vote for Romney. And so on. And he disaggregates in all those ways. And here, and this is, I think, where the 2 points come together, I hope, the most depressing takeaway from Bishop is the more education you have, the less likely that you will engage in a discussion with somebody who disagrees with your politics. And it should be the opposite, right? It should be precisely the opposite. Education should be exposing you to other things. But in fact, right, it's part of the same echo chamber that you're describing. And, I don't see any way out of that except our schools. That is, our K through 12 schools, they're the public institution that's enjoined with teaching us how to speak across our differences, right? And teaching us a different way to speak than what the kids are exposed to in the rest of the political world. Just look at look at the debates. That's not a debate. I guess it was a little bit, but most of the things on TV that are called debates are just two people shouting. At their respective constituencies, okay, generally ignoring, okay, or demonizing the other. And the only institution that could possibly teach us another way to do that is our schools. But are they equipped to do it? And do we want them to do it? Look, it's hard, okay? And again, I speak from a place of enormous privilege, and I understand that, right? I also was a high school and a middle school teacher, right? But at a different time, right? And this is an extraordinarily complicated and polarized and nasty time. But I have a piece coming out about this on Sunday, which I'll send to Jack later on. You can look, and I say, look, if there are people in the class who are immigrants or maybe undocumented, okay, you don't do them any favors if you ignore this subject, right? I understand the impulse to make things safe. Things aren't safe. Nothing is safe, all right? It's a ridiculous pretension to think that it is. And don't just think it's Trump supporters only who want to build a wall or kick out Muslims. You can think that if you want. It's false, okay? I dug up all these numbers. It is true that 84% of Trump voters, or people saying they're going to vote for Trump, support a ban on Muslim travel to the United States. Hillary supporters, 37%. Bernie supporters, 27%. Those are big numbers, right? So less than Trump for sure, right? But that's a lot of human beings, right? Overall, 50% of American adults say they support a ban on Muslim travel to the United States. So you can say this is all about Trump, all right? You're wrong. You're just wrong, right? That's a convenient artifice, all right? So nothing's safe, right? But how do we do these kids any favors if we say, well, in this class, okay, we're not going to pretend or we're not going to acknowledge that one of the major party candidates doesn't want anyone of your faith, if they're Muslim, to come here. They already know that. I'd go even further. How could anybody challenge this idea, and I do think it should be challenged, if we don't engage it? I think it's utterly self-defeating. I understand the logic, right? And I understand the impulse, right? But there is no safety. And the safe space idea tricks us into thinking that we can make these environments that are somehow hermetically sealed, right, from all of the nastiness that's surrounding us. We cannot. And I would argue that we must not, because only within that space can we start to develop a different way of exchange. All right? And we can't do that if we don't take on these questions. We can't learn to do that. And that's really what we're talking about, right? If we're putting certain issues and certain ideas outside of discussion, it just won't work. Emily, this is a question I can answer easily. Yes! Yes! Absolutely, that is our job. And the worst thing on the land right now is the psychologizing of politics. I really appreciate your question because the language in your question, I understand you were being critical of that language, right? But we should look at it. It comes out of the world of psychology, right? Triggers and safety and trauma, right? Look, I have no doubt that people, especially minorities, are offended on our campuses by this or that, right? Okay, I'm not questioning what people feel. I am questioning whether what they feel should be a legitimate way for us to decide what's being discussed. People feel all kinds of things, right? And incidentally, if you want to say you don't like what I'm saying, okay, which I encourage you to do, you have to do better than it traumatized me. That's a totally subjective claim. I can't contest it, and that's exactly the problem, right? It's something going on in you. You're going to have to say it's incorrect for the following reasons. Okay, it's illogical because it doesn't match your presumptions, right? You're going to have to come at me with better than this upsets me, right? Also, the language of comfort. Since when is our job to make people comfortable? Oy vey, as my grandmother would say. You know, you go and you give a talk and somebody's commenting on the talk and they say, you know, Professor Zimmerman, I was really uncomfortable by, X. And I always feel like saying, well, good. Like my job is not to make you comfortable. If I have, I've failed, right? I've just confirmed what it was you thought. Now, back to the PC point, it seems to me there are legitimate and illegitimate ways to do this, just like everything in education, right? I never purposefully try to make somebody feel bad. That's not my job, right? But I understand in the course of education, they will, if education's working, because they will be confronted with ideas that don't match their presuppositions. That is a source of discomfort. And it should be, right? So this psychologizing of politics, and look, I mean, I'm not saying anything against psychologists. Some of my best friends are psychologists, right? And I won't tell you. I benefit in all kinds of ways, all right, from psychologists, right? But I don't think the languages and the idioms that they use are the right ones for us right now. Okay? Because they don't lend themselves to a back and forth, right? Indeed, if someone says they're traumatized, if you question that, you know what you're doing? Re-traumatizing. Validate my trauma. Go on, do some validating. What? And incidentally, if I may, right, this is a very beautiful campus. It's expensive to attend, right? I would love for somebody at a place like this institution or mine who says they were traumatized by something that a professor said, to go to like a place where there are Syrian refugees or a place where they're like survivors of sexual abuse and with a straight face say, I'm traumatized too. I'd love to see that. You can't, right? I mean, we are taking that term and we're emptying it of meaning. It's like people that call everything a lynching, right? It's like, dude, if you think that bad thing was a lynching, you don't know enough about lynching. Read up, right? Or everything's a Holocaust, right? No, it's not. Like, read a little about the Holocaust. You'll see, yeah, that did suck. It wasn't a Holocaust, right? Okay, so this bad thing that somebody said, it sucked. You should criticize it. But trauma? Oh, I can't eat and sleep, right? What are we teaching people when we use that idiom? The sociologists talk about feeling rules, right? That is, feeling is subjective, but the social arrangements that we create and the rules promote certain kinds of feelings, right? Legitimate certain kinds, make others more common. When we use these languages, aren't we actually encouraging people to feel traumatized? And how are we going to have a discussion with them after they've done that? Okay, that's the end of my sermon. Thank you, Emily. I encourage you to find virtually and in person as many people who are not voting for your candidate as you can, and talk to them about why they're not. Okay, I do this with the people that write about my columns, I will not. There's no reason for me to disguise this. I mean, I am appalled at the specter of Trump. I yield to nobody in my outrage that this person is a major candidate for president, But my job is to try to understand why millions of people see it otherwise. All right? And there's this incredible irony in the fact that Trump himself, who is so dismissive and so abusive towards people that he disagrees with, that people like me say the same thing about the basket of deplorables. That people like me make Trumpian remarks about Trump supporters. What's loathsome about Trump is the way that he demonizes and vilifies anyone who challenges him. Isn't it then ironic that people like me, who can't stand Trump, do the same thing regarding his supporters? And you know why? We don't know any! Because the country's so unbelievably polarized. As you might guess, just listen to me for an hour, I'm sort of like every Republican's favorite Democrat. Some people think I'm a Republican, which is totally hilarious, right? Just because I care about these issues, right? So it's not uncommon I'll be invited to go to Republican events, like as the token Democrat. So a few weeks ago, I went to the Cato Institute, which is this very well-established Republican outfit in Washington. It's got a 9-story building, 300 people. I spent the whole day there, and I said, okay, my goal today is to meet a Trump supporter. You know what? I didn't. Because there in Washington, that part of the Republican Party, no Trump supporters. I kept asking people, couldn't there just be at least one? And I'm like, what, are you kidding? That guy? Like, no way, no how. So, the polarization, it's so total, right? It doesn't really track with parties anymore, right? It's within parties, it's within regions, it's within classes, right? And so it seems to me that all of our jobs, is to try to meet people in any way, that disagree with us and try to understand why. So I was on an airplane coming back from Ghana, and there's a guy sitting next to me, an American guy who's a missionary. And I could, after talking to him for 5 minutes, he's from Kentucky, he's a pharmacist, I could tell he was a Republican, and eventually we got to the subject, And he tells me that he thinks Trump is a bully. He thinks Trump is a hothead. He thinks Trump is unchristian, especially in the way that he talks about women. He thinks Trump is unqualified to be president. He thinks he's extremely worried about the idea of Trump having access to the nuclear football. And then at the very end, what's coming, he says, oh, and I'm voting for him. And I'm like, dude, I agree with every single thing you said about Trump. How are you voting for him? And, he replied, and again, this is just one guy talking, but I think this sort of thing you learn. He said his view was the political system is utterly broken. And he would never vote for anybody that had anything to do with it. So that means, not Kasich, not Cruz, obviously not Hillary, not Bernie, not anyone. Not anyone. What he found attractive about Trump was that Trump had zero political experience. He had zero involvement, at least officially, as a politician. And I said, but isn't this an enormous risk, given everything you just told me about Trump? And he said, you're right, and it's a risk we have to take. Now, again, I found this unpersuasive, all right, but I learned a lot from the conversation that I would never learn talking to my colleagues or my grad students, right? And I think that's the charge for all of us. You don't have to agree with anybody. You do have to try to figure out why their world makes sense to them, even if it doesn't make sense to you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah.